Okay, good morning, goedemiddag, gomoron. Nice to see everyone. Welcome back to the second day of the After the Deluge conference. My name is Mark Reinhardt from Stockholm University, together with Sanneke Kuipers from Leiden University. We will be facilitating the discussion for the next about an hour and a half. We'll end a little bit before 11 to give people time to have coffee here on site. So let's call it 10:45 or such. We've been through a number of fascinating panels yesterday. We're moving on to the question of learning, which actually we started to talk a little bit about in the last session yesterday, discussing the challenges of learning after crises, of course, a classic challenge, but also the challenge of learning during crises, because elongated, protracted crises like COVID present us new opportunities to learn actually as a crisis is unfolding. And so perhaps there's new dynamics, perhaps they're the same old dynamics, we don't know. But to help us to untangle those issues, we have an expert panel. We have 5 people today, which is great, but it also means that Sanneke and I might have to be a little tough on time and moving the discussion along if necessary. Let me introduce our distinguished panel in order of the speakers that are listed. We have Wout Brokkema from Leiden University, the Institute of Security and Global Affairs in The Hague, which several people at the table are affiliated with as well. He's also part of the Crisis Research Center at Leiden University, one of the oldest crisis research centers in Europe. And his research focuses on the dissemination of knowledge during and after crises, so that's where the learning element comes in for him. We have Marij Swinkels, who is at Utrecht, the School of Governance in Utrecht. I've worked with Marij on several projects, many of them European related, looking at belief systems and European leaders during crises. So some fantastic research on what forms their beliefs, how they express their beliefs, and how they sometimes get locked into those beliefs as well, which is really fun. She continues to teach and do research at Utrecht, and I want to say she won the Utrecht University Outstanding Teacher Talent Award the other day, which I want to throw out there. Not really the other day, but I still want to say that. Anyway, we have Olivier Borraz from Sciences Po. I think many of you know Olivier and his work on risk regulation and risk governance over the years. He's been really a forefront in the discussion of risk regulation instruments in different countries and how those are used and the effects that they have. And Olivier has been with us yesterday. So it's been nice to hear those thoughts, and we'll hear from him today specifically on learning. Let's see, we have Edward Deverell, our colleague from the Swedish Defence University in Stockholm and a good friend of many of us. Edward is an associate professor there in the Department of Security, Strategy and Leadership and in the political science division within that. And I would say, is one of Sweden's leading thinkers on learning after crises, wrote his thesis on learning, organizational learning after crises, which he defended in Utrecht, if I remember correctly, Edward, because I was one of your paranymphs. So that was good fun. And then we have Menno van Duin, who many of you know Menno. Menno's been around in the crisis research community for a long time. He actually helped found the COT, right? Yes, back in the day when also one of the early crisis or research institutes, consultancies in Europe. He now works at the Institute for Physical Safety, is how it translates, the old fire academy, right, which has been reformed and expanded its remit and such. And of course, when you talk about crisis learning, Menno is one of the people to speak to. He's worked on whether micro crises, tiny crises should be studied in order to uncover what they might say about big crises. So are there hints and clues and patterns in mini crises that tell us something about the big crises? So that's our group. I've already spoken too long. So I will hand over. So just to review with everybody, this is ideally a conversation for the next hour and a half or so, hour and 45 minutes. But we would, of course, like to hear your interventions. But let's try to limit those to around 5 minutes so that we can, and of course, if you have other good stuff to say, hold it in reserve for the conversation and deploy it then, because we'll have plenty of talks and discussions and questions. And questions between the panel members and from the audience at home and the audience here in Leiden. So, Wout, over.
If we have a question from the audience, please step into the light again.
Perfect.
That was really helpful yesterday.
I don't know if you see, but there's a microphone behind me. Yeah. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and then come on up. There's nothing stopping you. Just queue behind the microphone, yeah. 2 meters distance, please, in the queue. But, Marij, you have looked at narratives regarding time during crises and as they play out in the blame game.
Yeah. So I'm not a crisis learning scholar. I think much of my research is actually focused on what happens in the early stages of decision making. But I'd like to share 2 lessons here today. One comes from an article I recently wrote with one of my colleagues in Utrecht, Joram Feitsma. And another lesson I'd like to share comes from my PhD thesis, which I did not bring to show here, but I just brought it for Wout. But it looks a bit weird lying here next to me. So I think the first lesson that I would like to share here that I derived from this analysis that we did on the role of time in dealing with this COVID crisis. So we analyzed how politicians use time as a sort of blame avoidance strategy. And we studied this in the Dutch context. So how does the Dutch PM, the Dutch Minister of Health, which have been on the forefront, how did they use time as a strategy to dodge basically the long-term questions of this crisis and the lessons maybe that could be learned? And what we've seen in our analysis is that, well, they play with time in 3 different ways. So they use time to play with, to narrow down the time horizon that we take into account. So they, for example, use framing such as we're sailing on side, or it's a race against the clock, you know. So they use this as ways of narrowing down the time horizon. They play around in this crisis, so that's also a barrier of what I see hinders learning, is that they organize some sort of institutional rhythms and decision-making processes that narrow down both time horizons. So here in the Netherlands, we've very much focused in our decision-making using the corona dashboard with daily infections as a sort of institutional mechanism to only steer our decision-making on what happens here and now, and maybe also adding on to what Wout was saying before, we also saw that the way that they organized advisory boards and committees surrounding the Dutch cabinet was very much, one issue focused, which also did something with, of course, what they were doing in the moment, and not so much what they were, what they could also learn from this on the long term, what kind of alternative, broader implications of these crises could be. And the third strategy that we analyzed in the press conference that we looked at is that leaders selectively name the uncertainties and risks at play. So one of the most famous lines I think that we've, as Dutchies, heard our Prime Minister say was, we have to take 100% of the decisions with 50% of the knowledge available, which of course also directs us to just being in the here and now. So we need all that we have now to already deal with what's here. So we cannot think about what will happen in the future, which is of course also something that in later accountability episodes or learning processes one can sort of retreat to, like, we didn't know, we were just doing what we needed to do in that moment. So what we concluded from this is that really helps to maintain this sort of short-term focus in the crisis and maybe provide barriers for learning. So here the pattern seems more or less to be like, the more temporally constrained and one-sided the view, the more politically viable the communication is perceived to be, but well, the less learning maybe takes place. So we see this as problematic for the potential of learning of this crisis. So that's maybe a first lesson from that paper that we wrote. So nothing on EU leaders there, but mostly about Dutch leaders and how they provide barriers for learning. Then I was also thinking about what can I learn from this 4 years of PhD research into, and what can we learn from this crisis. So in my PhD study, I studied the role of EU leaders' ideas in the Euro crisis. And here I tried to show that leaders in the EU often fail to sort of bridge this gap to overcome their competing ideas and really provide a joint response to EU crisis. And the risk of that is that they continue to debate solutions at a sort of technical, ready-to-use level of policy instruments and incentives. Therefore, managing transboundary crisis then at the EU level becomes a sort of technocratic, technical leadership exercise, which may also sort of leads to, again, this short-sightedness, short-sighted crisis responses, and limits debates to what we can do here in the here and now, and not so much in the future. And one thing I sort of concluded or implied from my findings here in this in my PhD thesis, to learn from this is that for us as crisis management scholars, but also for those that do European crisis management, is that leaders should really challenge themselves to move beyond just this technocratic approach of dealing with transboundary crisis, and should take time also during a crisis to start reflecting upon what's happening and what can we learn from this in the future. And I think it also taps into what Wout was saying, that already on the go, also here in the Netherlands, in between the waves, there was, I was very disappointed as a Dutch citizen to sort of see what learning took place. And I think, the same is true also for the EU crisis context, where leaders don't really take time to sort of step back during the ongoing long-term crisis and reflect upon what's happening and what can we learn from this. And in my thesis, I point to the literature on adaptive leadership, a term which is coined by Ronald Heifetz and others. And I think this could be a concept that, we should also study in transboundary crisis, that leaders really take time to reflect upon these adaptive challenges that are ahead of them, and how they can really understand the complex causes of a crisis, the underlying dynamics, their own ideas about this, and take this as a precursor for how they want to really overcome and learn from this crisis. So that's maybe my two lessons. The research challenges that coming out of that, I think, are also related to that. So how can we study what kind of leadership repertoires work in these long-term difficult crises, and how can we, or how can politicians not only use time to avoid blame avoidance, but also take time to learn during a crisis.
Great, thank
Until
you, Marij.
here.
That was terrific. I mean, reflecting both on the subject and future agendas. And I think it speaks a little bit to the discussion, the last panel yesterday, where Chris Ansel said, you can plan to learn, so put processes and procedures in place so that the decision-making apparatus has learning moments or learning ethos, I don't know what you'd call them, in place while a crisis is unfolding, and not just wait for learning after it comes. Because as both of you said, the likelihood that you're going to get kind of meaningful, and I think the others will say this as well, the likelihood you're going to get meaningful learning in the aftermath of the crisis is very limited, for a bunch of reasons we're going to tease out probably today, but not least your, what would you call that, rhetorical entrapment, that you're using discourses which essentially are very short-term, are very focused on short-term horizons. And to me it's an interesting question, does that then lock us into short-termism? I think that's not my idea, it's yours. It says this can be problematic for the potential of public administration to address long-term problems, these discourses. Yeah. I think the question of tackling the next crisis, longer-term problems, in the creeping crisis terminology, the underlying problem comes to the fore here. But we'll keep talking about that. But before we do, we'll hand it over to Olivier. Can you hear us okay?
Yep.
Perfect.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and for this conference. And sorry not to be physically present with you. So very quickly, my work is I've been working now for several years on crisis preparedness, how we prepare for various crises related to nuclear accidents, to volcanoes, and now to pandemics. And I've been studying with colleagues the current management of the pandemic in France. We came out with a little book last can't see it.
The title is blurred, unfortunately, Olivier.
Yeah, that's why I'm trying to see how I can unblur it. But anyway, it's called COVID-19, an organizational crisis. It's in French, unfortunately. But as the title suggests, we are looking at the handling of the crisis from an organizational point of view. It's referring to what Wolfgang was saying yesterday. It's a process tracing approach to understanding the decisions taken during the first wave in the French government, try to make sense of them. And also, and this again goes to Wolfgang if he's in the room, using extensively the work of Graham Allison and Irving Janis. So we really try to use insights from the literature to understand what was happening in the French case. So part of the book was on learning, and since then we've been continuing to work on the topic of how organizations have been handling this crisis since last March 2020, and so it's a research project financed by the French National Research Agency called Organizations in Crisis, and it's really about learning from organizations how they, at the local and national level, how they were able to adapt. And to start off with on the question of learning, I guess for me, drawing lessons from a crisis like this requires three things: measures, traces, and reports. Measures, what I mean by that is how the effects of the government's decisions are being measured, both to evaluate their effectiveness and also their benefit risk or cost benefit. In other words, how have countries tasked experts, agencies, research bodies to produce data on the results of and effects of their decisions, with the short-term goal, as we said yesterday, of adapting the response as a crisis unfolds, and the longer-term goal of preparing for future crises. Second dimension needed is traces. Here I mean written sources, recordings, documents, which can later serve to analyze the decisions taken in order, here again, to prepare for future crises. So how have countries kept trace of their decisions? How will, in the future, policy analysts, organizational sociologists, historians, or even future decision makers be able to study these decisions and gain knowledge on how decisions were made in situations of uncertainty or crisis? And finally, reports. By this, I mean all the different productions, such as parliamentary reports, official investigations, hot washes, after-action reports that are designed to draw lessons from the crisis on how the organizations behaved, how communication channels operated, how plans worked out, etc. What I want to stress here is that on all three points, on all three of these dimensions, looking at the French case offers a pretty worrying picture. Regarding measures, I mentioned this very briefly yesterday already in the discussion, but there has been no systematic effort to measure the impact of the lockdown, the curfew, the compulsory wearing of masks, the sanitary pass, or any of the other measures. Some agencies in France have focused on some issues such as mental health, but for the most part, we still lack systematic data to conclude on the impact of the lockdown, for instance, both its effect on the curve and also its unintended effects, or any of the other measures by that. There is a general belief that the measures worked, but this is based on random observations, correlations, and confusing models with science. And while important efforts in medical research were made to gain knowledge on the virus itself, on its consequences in terms of health, or its possible treatments on the vaccine, no similar efforts were undertaken to measure the consequences of the decisions taken on other diseases or their economic and social impacts. In a sense, this could be called a production of ignorance, focusing attention exclusively on COVID-19 and avoiding to measure the effectiveness and collateral damage of the decisions taken. On the second dimension, traces. National authorities in France and their experts have knowingly left no written traces of their discussions prior to the important decisions, providing only official notices and communications. The reason for this seems to be mainly driven by accountability issues, as many complaints have already been filed in French courts against decisions taken as early as March 2020. But this implies that a decision as important as a national lockdown decision taken on March 12th can never be analyzed other than by asking the main protagonists to recount their experience. And we all know the limitations associated with this type of information. And since the fall of 2020, all the important decisions now are being taken weekly by a specific body called the Security and Defense Council, which is a temporary organization in France designed for war situations, and where decisions are made secretly. So there are no written traces of their discussions in this instance. And finally, on the third dimension, reports. I won't go into detail because time is passing, but we have had a range of reports for the moment by the parliament, by investigation bodies, but these have usually led to very limited criticism. mainly focusing on why we didn't have enough masks at the beginning, and all the recommendations made were never really followed up. And meanwhile, the administration in charge of crisis management in France, the Secrétariat Général à la Défense et la Sécurité Nationale, so the National Secretary, the National Defense Secretary, General Secretary, National Secretariat for Defense and Security, which sits under the direct authority of the Prime Minister, which is in charge of crisis management, is currently headed by the former number 2 of the Ministry of Interior, who at the time of the first wave was in charge of handling the crisis, and he has publicly declared that there would be no lesson learning exercise at the national level. So how can we account for this general attitude not wanting to draw lessons from this crisis? One official line of argument is that this crisis is simply too unique. It is an unprecedented event that cannot compare to any other, except maybe the 2 world wars and the 1918 pandemic. And so accordingly, it should be made apart and not be used to draw lessons. And such an argument allows, indeed, for a heroic account of the crisis. The President, his Prime Minister, the Ministry of Health, the General Director of Health, the Scientific Council can present themselves as having managed a unique situation on their own, doing what had to be done with limited knowledge, little time to decide, and making some hard but necessary decisions. In other words, taking their responsibilities. And this is actually the pattern for the important decisions taken over the last year and a half. Each time, the President goes on the air to announce an immediate decision in front of a pending threat, even though each time warning signs were all over the place for several weeks. This argument also allows to maintain the crisis outside the normal operation of government. And this leads to a striking feature of the French strategy since March 2020, the constant, permanent creation of new organizations alongside existing ones to provide the authorities with more flexible and rapid response. In so doing, these authorities, the President himself, express their distrust toward their own administration, accused of being overly bureaucratic, cumbersome, caught in internal strife, ineffective, unable to respond swiftly, even though some of these organizations had actually been designed explicitly for this type of situation. And while at the same time it promotes small and agile structures, which Emmanuel Macron is particularly fond of. And when the decisions taken prove to be ineffective or hard to implement, a situation which can easily be explained by the fact that during their conception, the conditions under which they would be implemented were overlooked, the President and his government will criticize their administration for poorly implementing their decisions. And now, as the crisis is subsiding, the President is relaunching his reform proposals for public administrations and hospitals, which he had put on hold since the beginning of the crisis, with an even stronger argument in favor of reforming these organizations, their lack of agility in a crisis situation. But for such an argument to hold sway, no effort has to be made to produce lessons on how these public organizations actually responded to the crisis, since in the same way as the lockdown worked, these administrations failed, period. Yet our own observations contradict this assertion. During this crisis, no organization collapsed. On the contrary, public organizations were able to adapt very quickly to a new situation with their activities being profoundly disturbed sometimes and most of the staff working home. They had to solve problems they had never encountered before, and they were able to invent solutions that worked. In our book, in a research project since, we seek to explain under which conditions these adaptations were possible. And in so doing, we point to a limit in many hot washes and post-action reports, when they are undertaken, the tendency to focus on what went wrong, what failed, what did not function, rather than on what actually worked, how and why. Indeed, as many of these organizations found themselves in a situation they had never encountered before, they had to adapt and improvise. In the process, they often adopted forms of cooperation and coordination that had not been planned for and sometimes required setting aside legal requirements. These forms are not uncommon in crisis situations, but they are rarely recorded, either because they are associated to individual behaviors, so underlining an individual sense of duty, his heroism, his personal qualities, or because they're considered as anecdotal, too specific or localized, or even illegal to justify any form of recording or even generalization. Yet, these situations share characteristics that could be applied to other circumstances. These characteristics should not be formalized in written plans, but they should be part of the training of future crisis management professionals. So in our book, we conclude that to draw lessons from this crisis, but also other large-scale disasters that we have encountered in the past, we need to shift from the idea that these events are unique, singular, one-off. We need to start from the premise that, albeit different in each case, they share characteristics that can be put in series, compared, analyzed, leading to the production of cumulative knowledge. This knowledge should pertain to how the crises emerge, how the alerts are analyzed, how the expertise is organized, how decisions are taken, how individuals and organizations cooperate, how problems are solved. But for the moment, in France, as in many other countries, large-scale crises remain unique and extraordinary events outside the normal stream of governmental affairs, and I think this is a major barrier to lesson learning. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Olivier. A good reminder, I guess, that when we're talking about learning lessons, we're not just looking into what went wrong and trying to hold people accountable for bad deeds, but also what went right in terms of the resilience of some of our public administration organizations. That's important lessons to learn as well. And also nice that you bring us down to the French context. We're going to move to the Swedish context now with Edward Deverell. Edward, can you hear?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference and this panel. I'm very happy to be almost here, and unfortunately that I couldn't join you in Holland. My introduction here will be in line with what the organizers asked for in terms of lessons from the COVID crises and 3 challenges to crisis research. And I'll base these lessons these lessons on a chapter that I wrote for a special issue in the Swedish Journal of Political Science, which is available on the web, but the articles are in Swedish, unfortunately, but the abstracts are in English, so they should be able to find that on Google. So we often talk about, in our research field, we talk about the crisis management cycle in terms of preparedness, the actual decision-making, and all these processes that follow into learning towards the end of this kind of cycle. But I mean, that's one way of looking at it. But of course, we can also talk about actual crisis learning as a cycle in itself. I use the concept of inter-crisis learning and intra-crisis learning as Donald Moynihan came up with some 10 years ago, where inter-crisis learning is learning from previous crisis to prepare for the next, while intra-crisis learning is learning during or within an actual crisis episode. And this means that we have this cycle where the inter-crisis learning then is really about preparing, drawing lessons from previous crises to be able to manage the coming crisis in a reasonably appropriate way. This really was the real kind of preparedness puzzle in terms of the Swedish approach here. We have this developed, prosperous, historically, in a historical perspective, very safety-seeking country, which then was not at all prepared for this kind of crisis. This makes the Swedish case interesting, and what even makes it more interesting, and this is, of course, as a Swedish crisis management scholar, it's quite fortunate that we have this crisis that really have this contested approach where politicians took the back seat while experts kind of were driving these processes, which makes it also interesting in a international perspective. But we really have this way of using former crisis experiences to form the next approach. And here we see learning, but we also see unlearning, because the whole system arrangement is based on how we have actually managed previous events. And what's interesting here is that 10 years ago, we had this issue of pandemics was really on the agenda. I mean, after SARS in 2002, after the bird flu, and especially after the swine flu. It was really the top topic in this whole preparedness community. So all these lessons then were kind of shifted and forgotten, and instead we've been focusing on territorial defense, terrorism, more kind of hard security issues, which of course then was unfortunate when this event happened, because I mean we could always talk about putting our resources into anticipation or into resilience, as Wildavsky did this distinction. And in a way, this kind of pandemic is one thing that could be anticipated, that was anticipated 10 years ago, but then suddenly it was not. Which of course then led to a totally unprepared community to deal with this issue, at least in the Swedish context. We also have a distinction of innovation and planning, where the Swedish response then was totally based on the plans, and the plans for this kind of traditional communicable disease, influenza, while this COVID then was a bit different in terms of the airborne transmission, for instance. And I mean, in a way, we talk about the Swedish response as being very kind of factual and very evidence-based, very scientific. But that's not the whole picture, because we also had a difficulty of adapting and innovating and listening to the actual research in terms of the transmission, for instance. And I would say that my hypothesis here is that we have this government agency of the Public Health Agency that really is an agency run by medical doctors that base all their decisions on evidence-based methods. While we have the other agency of importance here, the Civil Contingencies Agency, the MSB, which is more of a rescue service inspired, social science inspired government agency, guided more by the precautionary principle, where measures taken before there's actual evidence is prioritized. So these kind of values then and these cultures clash, as the medical evidence-based agency will look for complete evidence before they actually change their minds. And I mean, we all know that you never have complete evidence in a crisis. It's the uncertainty that's the actual defining part of the crisis. So in terms of advice then for the research community from this crisis, I would say that there's a few lessons here to be learned, and one of them that I find interesting, at least in the Swedish context, is how we as crisis researchers actually inform the public officials. I mean, there is some exchange, and there was even more exchange, maybe like some 5-10 years ago, I would say. But there is definitely some exchange going on. But the actual crisis management, as it was run by the Public Health Agency, is not at all in contact with the social scientists that form this research community. And then again, we kind of find this kind of sluggish response to failed sense making. So there's really no dialogue between the medical community and the social science community in terms of bridging and giving insights from our research community, insights such as broadening your information base, for instance. I mean, we had a public health agency that only talked to their experts and their researchers with the medical knowledge, basically, and they did not take this kind of number one tip of really going broader and finding critical voices, finding like other perspectives in how to deal with this. And maybe if they would have broadened their kind of expertise within their group, then maybe we would have a more innovative, and maybe we would have a more have had a more adaptive approach. There's also an issue about how to look at crises. If we should look at them as exceptions, or we should look at them as a kind of parts of our everyday life, especially in this long-term crisis that's kind of protracted and running over several years, and it's kind of beginning to really, I mean, it is part of our everyday life. So one way of dealing with this is then to how to see how our models really fit with this. Can we still say that crisis is something that differs from the norm or differs from everyday life? Or is it the risk of crisis that is part of our everyday life, and the actual crisis management that is the exception? The third challenge is the challenge of data collection. Oliver already talked a bit about that in terms of traces, which I think is really important, and we have the same issue in the Swedish case. And I also think that, I mean, we have started gathering data, and this is probably the perfect time. There's some breathing space within the government agencies, but it's still a lot of work. They still have a lot of work to do. They're still getting back into normal, the kind of normalities. So there's definitely a challenge here that we need to start collecting these data in terms of the actual lessons learned, and especially given that we don't always have the paper traces here. That makes it even more important, and more important to actually speak to these experts while their kind of memories are fresh. Thank you.
Thanks, thank you, Edward. I would encourage people to read Edward's memo. I think it's a good one, raising a bunch of interesting questions in the end, including, you know, if crises are becoming part of everyday life, how do we organize learning processes accordingly? But I'm a little bit struck with the assumption that all learning is kind of a good process, that, you know, learning is something that's unequivocally positive. And I'm thinking now, and Edward, you'd made me think of the Swedish response to the swine flu, H1N1. You know, the Swedish government was strongly criticized for overreacting on H1N1, you know, by implementing all these measures about washing hands and distance, and I think even masks came into play. And of course, it didn't really blow up, so everybody accused the government of overreacting here. And I wonder if that was playing a role in kind of a negative lesson learning on behalf of the health authorities to say, let's not run out too quickly and implement lockdowns and stuff and such in Sweden.
Can I expand a little on that question? There's an EU Commission report on pandemic preparedness that concluded during COVID that the best prepared countries performed least. So maybe that's something to reflect on from the different country perspectives.
Yeah. Huh. Fascinating. Thanks. All right, so let's hand it over to Menno then.
Yeah, thanks. It works? I hope.
I think so.
I would give some lessons, observations, 7, from and during the COVID crisis. And I know that still some of these lessons were mentioned before, and so colleagues already, and so maybe those lessons can bring us some further. The first is learning in a long-lasting and chronic crisis cannot only be organized after the event. Because of the extreme length of this crisis, I think it's also needed to do it during the crisis, because afterwards a lot of interesting observations and lessons may already be forgotten. Who remembers still, more than a year later, the reasons for a decision that was made or the way a problem was handled? Too much happened to remember all that. That's one of the reasons we, with our team, started already in March 2020, doing some sort of research, for instance, interviewing mayors 3 times during 1.5 years, so to help to understand the process of the crisis and the way they have to cope with different problems during that period. The second lesson, learning from a crisis like this should include more than only the work from scientists like you all are here and around the universities. I would suggest that the combined contribution of scientists, applied science, and practitioners and experts as well could bring us further than only a too scientific way of looking at the crisis situation and to forget some of the practical knowledge what have been already learned by all people involved. And this point I found also with in the paper of Uri Rose et al. Who will speak tomorrow, and he was my promoter, so what he says is always good. So. The third issue, in the studies that my research team and I undertook, we focused on the safety regions. We have 25 of those regions in the Netherlands. And although they have a lot in common, the difference between the safety regions were on several subjects bigger than we expected. At the beginning of the crisis, in March 2020, in particular the southern part of the Netherlands was hit. During the second wave, that started by the end of August, the western area of this country, known as the Randstad, experienced the most problems. But also personal and cultural differences between these regions really mattered. Comparing is not as simple as we sometimes would like to believe. So comparing between countries may be even a bigger challenge for me. So that's one reason I really wonder if so much energy would be taken to compare all those different countries. So for me, it's more interesting, for instance, to compare different cities in different countries, focusing more on the, and that's the fourth point as well, pointing not only on the national and centralized forms of response. For me, the local responses, in the Netherlands also the regional, can be equally interesting as well. A comparison between cities in different countries may be more interesting and also maybe be more possible than the comparisons between countries. The fifth element I would point on is on resilience. In some of our quick research studies, we were surprised about the responsiveness of individuals and the spontaneous organized forms of support. So focus on resilience. And the sixth point, focus on emerging organizations, as Dines called it in his the fourth of the four types of organizations involved in crisis. Focus more on emerging organizations. We were surprised to see how many new networks and other forms of institutional arrangement were formed during the crisis, in local communities, but also on a national scale, to organize the health problems. For instance, the dividing of persons for the intensive care was completely organized in new organizational arrangements. So, and the last one, focusing on the resilience and the emerging organizations. We already heard some of them in the discussion before. Resilience as well as emerging organizations are both examples for the need to focus more on success rather than on failure in this rather long crisis. So for me, learning on the job, more learning on the local decentralized organizations, local municipalities, more focus on resilience, more focus on emergent organizations, and more focus on success, I would.
Great.
Very brief.
That was very good, and actually tips on how to fix this. I mean, apparently, we have our work cut out for us, if what Olivier says is true, that politicians said there will be no lesson learning exercise during this crisis. That doesn't bode well for our academic efforts to encourage this a little bit more. I'm sure there's plenty of questions from the audience and from at home, but also amongst the panel members. mean, I will just kick things off before we we have questions. I mean, I think in several of the presentations there was a discussion of the obstacles to learning. Everything from a lack of willingness, as Olivier put forth, in Edward's paper, that the crisis managers are very quick to leave after the crisis and go somewhere else. So you have a kind of lack of institutional memory taking hold, and they don't want to talk about it either. There's also emotional and other issues. So there's a load of obstacles. If we sort of categorize those in terms of, and I'd like to hear from the panel members, if you're willing, what's the most important category of obstacles? Is it structural? There's something in the structure of the political system which prevents us from learning lessons. Is it societal? There's something in the political makeup of society, or there's something in the electoral incentives that prevent certain leaders from wanting to do this, or perhaps using learning for their own strategic purposes to damage another party? Or is it individual? Is it a leadership thing, that some leaders are more willing to be introspective and think and learn, and others are not? So is it individual, is it structural, or is there something even broader in society? That, just a small question for a Thursday morning. Anyone want to take a stab?
Well, I think that it's I mean, of course, there's all of these kind of categories influence in a way, but I think it's a lot of it is that it's the actual individual dynamics within the actual people that deal with these things, and I mean, after all, and I think all of us that are engaged in research on crisis and crisis management know that how difficult all of this is to actually in the fog of uncertainty and with time pressure, with all these values at stake, to make these decisions that have so great consequences for human life and for society. And I mean, we all understand and we know that these people try their best. They really do what they think is right. They're not bad people. They're not evil people at all, of course. And then to actually, so I think they all think that they did really good, and that's kind of the problem here. That after a while, when the critique has been raised, they all end up in an idea that after all, it was not that bad given the circumstances, and now we can move on to the next challenge that is inevitably going to take a lot of our time further on.
Okay.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
So I think with your question, like what is causing sort of these obstacles for learning, I think it would be nice to also look at the sort of complex causality that can be at play here. And I think if I reflect back on the lessons I presented here, that because there is no sort of mechanism or a structural institutional mechanism at play that allows maybe leaders to reflect upon this or to learn then during a crisis, then it also becomes a sort of individual problem, right? Or because there's this dynamic interplay between how leaders and society sort of interact together, this also makes it more difficult to learn. So I think, well, if we would sort of hypothesize from this, or if we would actually make this into a study, I think we could do some sort of fun qualitative comparative analysis work where we try and see how these different conditions play in together and cause these sort of, well, opportunities or obstacles for learning. So that could be something to take forward, also for research.
Political culture, no doubt, matters too. I mean, in Sweden, the classic response of, yeah, mistakes were made, we'll do better next time. That's allowed to fly. In other countries, it would never fly. Menno?
Yes, maybe I'm more optimistic. I think we've learned quite some things the first half year. Afterwards, most of those things that have been learned were institutionalized, etc. That's the first part of the answer, and of course all those factors you mentioned will influence the learning process. but also for me, when I teach students or others, I always give in Dutch a sentence which I will translate, and I cannot translate it the way I can say it in Dutch. But what you do seldomly, you won't do so good. So be a little bit modest in your expectations. For me, when you're on a 10-point scale, a 6 is already a very good number to achieve. So it's also a matter of scale and what you expect. And I'm very enthusiastic if they have a 6.
Pragmatism.
Yes.
Yep, absolutely. So Sarah Praley from Syracuse University is here with us. We also have Jörg Raab and there's another, oh, there's Lydia back there. And then we have one at home. Again, I don't know what home is, whether it's here or virtual. Anyway, virtually we have, we have Jella out there. But Sarah, after you.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks to the panel. I thought that you guys raised a lot of really interesting questions. Whenever I think of learning, I think of like Peter May's distinction between different kinds of learning. And the thing that kept popping up for me while you were talking was his concept of political learning. And that maybe during a crisis like this, the most learning that was going on was of the political nature. So kind of in reference to what Mark just previously said, that leaders were kind of learning what was popular and what wasn't with constituents and what they could kind of get away with. This was, I felt like, particularly the case in the United States at the state level and the local level where, you know, Ron DeSantis and the governors of Florida and Texas, totally mismanaged it, but didn't suffer any kind of political price. In fact, they're more popular, I think, because of their sort of hands-off approach. And so maybe that's what's happening while the crisis is unfolding, is just sort of, oh, lockdowns aren't popular, I guess we won't do them. And so how does political learning sometimes compete with other kinds of learning that you seem to prefer, which are more sort of instrumental, useful kinds of learning? I did note, though, I just looked up Bolsonaro's approval rating, and it's 24%. So maybe he is learning. There is a lesson to be learned that if you really screw up, you will pay a political price. But.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Why don't we have Jörg as well, and then give a chance for the panel to respond before we take 2 more questions, Lydia and then Jella and Wolfgang. So please.
Yeah, my question actually nicely ties into Sarah's and yours, and that is, in Creeping Crisis, sort of the functionalist administrative perspective that I heard mostly on the panel is probably not sufficient, because there's also a political side. We had elections in Germany, in the Netherlands, we will have elections in France. But even if we leave sort of the simple explanation of electoral competition away, we could also, for example, look at a perspective of maybe the decision makers and politicians do not want these evaluations. Wolfgang, a longer time ago, did a study on successful failure, where you have sort of such complexities and contradictions that you actually do not want to have a very close evaluation. And we heard yesterday politicians also want maybe avoid further polarization. They want to keep the trust in public institutions. And these complexities and dilemmas, at least sort of learning during the crisis, is maybe not in the interest of that, because then it will become part of the party competition. And I think in our work we should distinguish sort of the more normative perspective, which I have all sympathy for, and a real analytical perspective trying to understand why certain things happen or do not happen.
Thank you. This is speaking to the point of the blending of the learning challenge with the meaning-making challenge during a creeping crisis, where meaning-making has to take place over a really long, extended period of time. And part of that is What kinds of lessons do we say to the public that we are learning, if we say so at all, versus the kind of real lessons, that the more instrumental lessons that Sarah spoke to. To our panel, anything here trigger any thoughts or?
Can I come in?
Absolutely, Olivier,
Sorry.
please.
Yeah, a quick response, reaction. I think there's, we mentioned this yesterday also, but the comparative component of this crisis should not really be downplayed. I mean, I think many countries were constantly comparing each other, looking at each other, imitating each other. And I think a lot of learning, in particular political learning, took place through, we're doing this because the other guys are doing it. Or on the contrary, as was just mentioned, we're doing this because we don't want, because to distinguish ourselves from, so Florida is doing things differently from California and is explicitly adopting a different approach. But in Europe, it's striking to see how imitation was a strong driver for many decisions in countries. You know, and everyone justifying themselves with the fact that others were doing it. And even, I mean, in France, it's clearly we still lack evidence because, as I said, no written traces. But on why the lockdown, but clearly the fact that the Italians had done it just a few days before was a strong element of reference. I mean, because the Chinese had done it, but Chinese is an authoritarian regime, so that was a little bit difficult to transfer. But the Italians had done it, and that sort of serves as a lesson which can be used and to justify a strong action. And clearly, Macron, like many other leaders at that time, wanted to be seen as really taking strong positions and very quickly on this pandemic. And the lockdown was the right measure to be made, according to him. Another should comment on the barriers before. I think another important barrier, I guess this is probably the same thing in many other countries, is the fact that many people in charge of managing crises, in this case at least, but I think were not trained for this. I mean, many people who were managing the crisis in different centers had never had any training in crisis management. And so I think this is a strong barrier also to learning, because and then they move on, and this is very similar to Sweden. I mean, in France during the summer of 2020, most of the people who have been in charge of crisis management in different ministries and administrations moved on to other positions where they didn't have to manage crises, and they didn't leave any traces behind. So there was no lesson learning within these organizations. People just moved on, and people who replaced them had no training in crisis management. So, I mean, there again, I mean, I'm not saying we need a strong body of crisis professionals, but I'm saying is that, well, I mean, we've been training people for crisis management in France, and then when a real crisis occurs, it's not those people who are in charge, it's others who have no training, including policymakers who have never taken part in an exercise or whatever. And I think this is also, I think, a powerful barrier to lesson learning.
So do you think if they were sort of better trained, they would be more capable of thinking about how to reform and revise for the next crisis? You think they're more aware of the trade-offs, the dilemmas we talked about yesterday and such?
Well, and also more sensitive to the importance of gaining experience and knowledge and be able to be better prepared for the next ones. I think that could play a role. But I mean, because clearly experience is an important driver in these situations, and the people who were in charge of crisis here had no experience of managing crises. And what's even more important, in the French case, the people in charge of crisis management, particularly the organization, so the civil security, was explicitly put on the side by the government, because the government did not trust civil security to manage this crisis. So I think having people with limited knowledge doesn't make them training doesn't make them conscious of the importance of getting knowledge to be better prepared for the next crisis. Absolutely.
That can explain too your points that really struck me, that there's no data really on the impact of certain measures, for instance. Which makes me ask, is there no data, or were there no questions that were asked there? And also the idea that you mentioned there's no written evidence in France on what was happening inside, which is not completely untypical, that in the heat of the moment, no one is taking notes, diligently.
Well, no, but
future.
In this case, this goes to Paul's question on the web. In this case, this was an explicit decision not to leave written traces.
Okay.
It's not just that they didn't have time. They said, we don't leave traces because we are afraid of court trials. And I think this may be an important difference maybe with Sweden, and I would like, and I don't know if Edward has his thoughts about this, but I was told that in Sweden, people like Johan Carlson or Anders Tegnell cannot be tried, taken to court for decisions they made during this crisis. I don't know if this is true, but in France, clearly they can. I mean, clearly the ministers or the general, can, I mean, the prime minister, I mean, Edouard Philippe, prime minister at the time, very clearly stated, no traces. Because there are going to be trials, and there are already at least 150 court trials being filed. We cannot take the risk of having traces that would be used against us afterwards. So that's a clearly explicit accountability issue, like Paul suggests in the discussion, which is also a barrier to learning.
But I think then that translates into a lot of learning in the organizations implementing all the policy interventions during the crisis. And it's being embodied by the people who learned that do not move on, but are professional crisis managers. And I think maybe Wout can reflect on that, but we've seen that, for instance, with the Food Safety Authority fighting veterinary crisis in the beginning of the 2000s. These people moved on because they retire at some point, and we haven't had such a crisis in 10 years, and basically the crisis lessons are lost. So how do we retain those then in organizations?
Jalla Tusen has been waiting patiently from Heidelberg for a while, so I'd like to get her on before too long. Please, Jalla.
Goedemorgen, that's perfectly fine. So this is Heidelberg calling. Thank you so much for this inspiring panel. Olivier, I truly enjoyed your explanations on the French case, which struck me because, and that's the first part of the two questions or comments I have. It seems as if the French government learned how to obfuscate or how to blame shift. So I wonder whether my interpretation is correct here. So that's the first question, hopefully easy to answer. And the second question, I think is a bit more complex because, and I know Giliberto Capano is with us in the present audience. Ciao, Giliberto. Giliberto and I had a conversation at a certain point that if we look at the policy reactions to the crisis, we must differentiate between phases where a containment regime was built up and also phases where it was scaled down or dismantled. And I wonder to what extent we can work with the same learning models for these different types of policy response decisions, right? So I would think, well, with the building up of the emergency regime, we had more like learning under urgency, but this does not mean that like dismantling what was in place, like during the first wave or so, was like easier for politicians. So I wonder to what extent we can use one model to explain the different types of policy decisions taken. So the ones that meant instituting or strengthening containment, and the other one reducing or loosening containment regimes. So that's my more complex question, and it goes to the panel as a whole. Thank you.
Excellent. I encourage the panel to remember that and respond, but I want to take one more from here in the room. Lydia Caban from Leiden.
Good morning, thank you very much. I wanted to come back on the question of temporality and the articulation of the short-term and long-term as a barrier to learning. And it strikes me that I think there is something a bit paradoxical because, you know, a lot of the position here comes back to, you know, advocating for trying to incorporate the long-term. And yet, if you look at the literature on public policy and policy change, there is a sort of argument that policies are mostly incremental, and actually the crisis is the great moment to produce a change. But in the moment of the crisis, learning and producing that change seems very challenging. So it seems that as you would learn lessons, actually you lose some opportunity to produce a significant policy change. And then I think one of the challenges to Wout and maybe Maria, I think I'm very sympathetic and, about the idea of bringing in the long term, but then it brings also very challenging questions about what is a crisis, because if you try to designate policy regimes for, you know, thinking about transboundary crisis in the long term, which, you know, I think it's great, but then you also create a situation where you blur the boundary with normal policy making. And then, you know, how do you articulate this kind of regimes with, you know, social policies, environmental policies, and so on? I think there is a big challenge. And Olivier, I think it's, I'm very much in agreement, but I'm just wondering what are your alternatives? So are you advocating for a kind of experimentalist governance in which there is a sort of trial and error process as we discussed yesterday, which I think would work nicely for a mid to long-term crisis, where you know, like with the different waves of COVID, where you can, you know, try something and do something else at the next wave. But if you are really in the short term, is that, you know, how would you do that? Because that seems very challenging. And I think I also would like to come back on Sanike's point about, you know, actually does learning produce a better answer? And I think there's maybe some comparison to be made between France and the Netherlands, because Olivier, you said, oh, we need to compare crises and learn. The Netherlands has something a bit like that with the safety board. But I'm just wondering whether it actually produces a better type of crisis response. I don't have an answer, but that's a discussion for everybody.
Absolutely. We throw that to the panel now. I think it's only fair to let people chime in there. I've been told there's people waiting online with chat questions. Is that true or fake news, Henry? That's true. How many do we have? 3. Okay, so we'll do a quick round from the panel, and then I'll do my best to mix it in, including Wolfgang, who's here, has a comment too. So anyone from the panel want to either Jala's question or Lydia's question?
Do I start?
Please, Marij, yes.
Yeah, I think, of course, crises are always then perceived as a sort of opportunity to then produce these sort of long-term changes. But I think what we've tried to show in this article, so me and my co-author, is that politicians can also miss out on this opportunity. So it presents this option of actually producing changes, and then they sort of, well, don't use this opportunity. So my colleague and I both first initially shared our reflections on in a magazine on social affairs in the Netherlands, where he used also Kingdon's theory, where he tried to basically argue like, well, this crisis provides the opportunity to really connect it to the other salient issues or crises that are at stake at the moment, but we fail to actually do so. And so then when we thought about actually trying to turn this into an article, we thought about, okay, how do they use this concept of time and to as a sort of blame avoidance strategy to not learn from this crisis or not change the focus. So I think what is important is that crises itself don't lead or don't produce these changes, but it's individual actors in these crises that can do something. And I think from our observations, what we've seen here is that political leaders miss out on this opportunity to connect it to other crises and to actually produce these long-term changes. So yeah, they lose this opportunity to do so. I think that's what I would like to add here.
Thank you, Marij.
And then maybe to Olivier for the other
Absolutely.
question.
Olivier, please.
Yeah, very quickly on the questions, on Yali's questions. Blame shifting, yes, it is a strategy, but I mean, it goes a little bit deeper than that, because it's since the beginning of his presidency, Emmanuel Macron and his government have been very distrustful of their own administration and very decided upon a deep reform of the French administration. And so, as the crisis started, they expressed very explicitly the distrust. They did not associate them with the decisions taken, which meant that decisions were taken without any data often, and without very little knowledge of how they would be implemented. So automatically they were ineffective or raised problems, and then these problems were blamed on the administration, saying, well, look, hey, see? So it's blame shifting. It's also self-fulfilling prophecy. You're creating the conditions for these organizations to fail, and then blame them for failing, and then saying, well, you see, we need to change. So yeah, there was something like that. On the containment versus scaling down, I mean, yes, you're perfectly right. I think, and we haven't worked enough on this in France. The scaling down starting in May is actually considered by everyone here a very successful strategy. So the way it was organized by the current prime minister, actually, and this is why he became prime minister, was very innovative in the way of trying to bring together organizations to prepare to organize this. And you're right, it's totally different than the scaling up. And you're right. I mean, there are different. And as is different also now, the current situation where is it a crisis? Not a crisis anymore. Is this where do we stand? I think this is also a different type of situation where we need to gain learning experience. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And Edward, you were shifting in your seat a bit there, so I assumed you wanted to join in. Do you want me to wait? Can we take a few more questions, or would you like to say your piece now? Great. Thank you for that. Paul Kearney is beamed in. Thank you for that, Henry. Well done. Paul, floor is yours.
Thank you. I mean, I think Olivier addressed some of the questions. So it was really this question about what kind of process can we expect? So I think a lot of contributors are talking about almost sort of fantasy learning where it's simply, technical and, you don't have to worry about politics. And then the other end of these sort of accountability exercises where people are going to be really defensive and, so Olivier was describing some extremes of that. I think in the UK, from what I can tell, it's just very kind of defensive ministers, saying, essentially it's not being able to reflect because people are not really interested in the reflections. They're interested in getting rid of them, in the next election. So I wonder if we have a nice extreme there. On the one hand, we don't want ministers shredding documents. On the other hand, we don't really want a kind of fantasy style learning that no one's going to pay attention to because it assumes away politics. So I wonder if the panelists want to reflect on that. What kind of learning is feasible under these conditions, if you want politicians to actually listen to any of the learning points rather than make them because you think they're sensible.
Thanks very much, Paul. I was thinking of questions along the similar lines, and actually, I think Menno probably has something to say on that question. It gets back to the political learning versus administrative learning. But is it okay if we take Wolfgang real quick? Sure. Yeah? Sorry, I'm ruining the process here, but it's too interesting. Wolfgang, Sibu?
Yeah, I was just thinking about whether or not there are kind of litmus tests, whether the necessity to learn is taken seriously or not. And I do think we have those litmus tests at hand. I mean, one is whether or not the right questions are being asked, and second, to what extent learning is being institutionalized. And we do know, also from the literature, of course, about organizational learning, for example, I mean, the right questions are exactly those key actors are reluctant to address. And the question whether or not something is, learning is being institutionalized, it depends on the question to what extent the necessity to learn is taken seriously in the first place. And Jörg, who's sitting next to me, reminded me of the fact, just to give you an example, that during the process of this large-scale and unprecedented privatization of the East German economy after German reunification, very early, the decision of the agency in charge, the Treuhandanstalt, was to secure a seamless documentation of everything they did. And the dramatic example is interstate war. I mean, all the armies are pretty much aware that they need to keep a war diary, for example, which then becomes the source of for historians. Or after World War I, we had all these white books of the governments of the participating countries. So this is a litmus test that is very easy to take because, I mean, it depends on the willingness of governments to document what they did and to install committees or commissions, whatever it is, in order to institutionalize learning.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Now, Menno.
The discussion reminds me on my own PhD project almost 30 years ago, and I tried to focus on what is learning, and for me about ask the right questions. What is learning? Who learns? And for me, learning then was learning is doing, learning is knowing, and learning is disseminating. So I try to combine these elements for different accidents and disasters. And also, then I said, well, learning you can do in terms of prevention. We are very much focused on prevention, also in the discussions. When we compare things, have we done the right thing? It's focusing on prevention and doing it better than the next time. But for me also, learning is preparing, and learning is learning how to react. This is also the way to respond to different situations. And maybe we're focused too much on the prevention and think that we can prevent the next crisis. And maybe we can learn more from response and doing the response better, communication. And yesterday we had a discussion about that. So for me, the questions still remain that Wouter started. Who is learning and what is learning?
Thank you very much, Menno. I see we have a visitor beaming in, Janna, yeah, Hukkinen from Finland, I presume.
Hello, everybody. Greetings from Helsinki. Yes. Several of the presenters, thanks for the presentations, and several, almost all, I think, made a point of these chronic crises that we have entered a reality where crises are more or less repeating, and we can expect them. And if I look at how the Finnish government has treated the outcomes of the pandemic and what they could learn, and the key sort of longer term measures have to do with first of all, legal reform of the law on preparedness actions, and secondly, looking at the so-called comprehensive security model, which is sort of, speaks to the organizations of preparedness. But what I find intriguing, if you accept that the new normal is chronic crisis, from an institutional point of view, I would imagine that you would not sort of focus on specific laws on preparedness and crisis, but rather focus on reforming the normal legal structure so that it would have sort of a special clauses for these chronic crises. In a sense, that would be a way of normalizing it. And similarly, or analogously, in the organizational sense, you would not have a specific crisis organization, but you would actually have the normal organizations practice into a mode of treating chronic crisis. And I don't know if there's any of this, there's not really a discussion in Finland about this, but I don't know if any of this may be a question, does this happen elsewhere in Europe? Is there even a discussion of this sort of a preparedness for these creeping crises? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Janna. I mean, this does speak to, that point speaks to several issues brought up by our panel members, which is, the long-term changes that learning could potentially bring, and whether they could not only deal with or help us to improve our preparation for the next crisis, but also to remove or to address some of the underlying conditions which are leading to, a succession of crises, whether they're viruses or zoonotics and such. So that's the crisis as opportunity question, of course, in the literature. Marij?
Yeah, so maybe also as a sort of broader question to us here. So we're here with crisis management experts, and we've been talking in rather abstract terms about learning from crisis, organizations, what they should do, what they cannot do, how they can use this opportunity to learn from it. And just as a question to all of us, maybe to think about, if we talk about the need to focus on the successes of learning, or when learning can be a success, what then are examples that we have about what good learning is or has been in this crisis so far? So do we know of specific organizations or networks or countries or whatsoever that learned well so far? And can we make these a bit more concrete so that we may have some first case studies to dive or delve deeper into?
Yeah.
As a question to all of you, I'm curious.
I agree with it to everyone, but with a special eye towards Olivier and Edward, for instance, since they have case study or country study evidence. Edward?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, what comes to my mind with Marij's question here, and it also kind of ties a bit up to Wout's earlier comments about the political side and the technical side of learning. If we look beyond the actual, or back from the COVID crisis and look into our previous experiences in terms of the tsunami, which I know that Sanneke has done research on also, Southeast Asian earthquakes of 2004, and how they affected the organization of crisis preparedness in the Swedish government sector. That was a huge learning process that went on for years with different evaluations and commissions, and ended up with constructing a whole organization within the actual cabinet, basically, or in the immediate access to the prime minister, to be able to inform the prime minister about whatever signals could appear that could lead to a crisis. And I mean, in a way, that's a technical lesson, but it also draws into the political side of it, because that could only happen after we actually had a power shift, where the government that was in charge of the kind of lapse, the failed response, was left power, and the actual new government came in, and only then could we have this kind of learning process being implemented. And then again, when the next government, when the old government came back, they removed it. They didn't remove it, but they removed the immediate access to the prime minister from this new crisis organization within the cabinet. So in a way, that also kind of leads to disconnecting, in the Swedish case, disconnecting political power from the actual crisis management and the actual crisis decision making, which I think was had enormous consequences in how the Swedish case was managed, and probably would have been could have been a totally different response with a more kind of political oriented action, rather than just kind of leaving it to the medical experts and the scientists in the public health agency. So I mean, in a way, we have there a good example of organizational learning on a large scale, but then again, kind of dismantled for political reasons, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I come in briefly? Yeah, I think Jan is asking a very interesting question, which I've been also struggling with here in France. Particularly, I'm working with some administrations, and the question is being, do we need to have specific services departments in charge of crisis management? Do we need to work this in the normal operations of these administrations? What does this mean? What are the cons and pros and cons? I mean, there are countries in which clearly there's now they have to the control tower system with like South Korea, for instance, where they have one organization in charge of all crisis management. Does that work? It seems to, but will it work for any other crisis? We don't know. Other countries have more the diffuse systems. So in this crisis, what I find interesting is that some countries actually followed plans and procedures. I mean, Sweden, with all its, maybe the criticism can be addressed, still more or less stuck to what had been planned initially. I mean, they didn't improvise a whole lot. France went totally into improvisation, and many other countries are somewhere in between. I mean, so I think this is an interesting also lesson. Why did France had been preparing for 20 years for a crisis like this? For 20 years, we had organizations, plans, procedures, everything was ready, and then the crisis comes in, and we sort of put everything aside and reinvent a whole new system. I mean, that is a major puzzle for us. And just to quickly, I mean, go ahead, I see they should raise their hand, but in the chat, Wright is also asking a very interesting question. And I think part of the lessons we can draw also is to what point are the consequences of all these neoliberal reforms or new public management reforms, call them what you want, but to what point do they make our administrations more vulnerable, more difficult to coordinate? And clearly, in the French case, and it's in public administrations at all levels, the multiplication of organizations, the multiplication of agencies, more or less independent, the idea of having independent, accountable structures has its reasons in normal times, but in crisis times becomes incredibly complex to coordinate. And the only way that it can be coordinated is by creating new organizations on top of the existing ones, and which creates more confusion. And so I think this is really also, I think, going back to Yanni's question, I think the real challenge for us is not to immediately think in terms of organizations. And I'm an organizational sociologist, so I mean, I know what I'm talking about. I think there's so much to be learned from the way that administrations actually solve problems during this crisis and other crises in the past, which we could work upon to build this in the normal process of these organizations, rather than trying to immediately solve the question by saying, do we need a specific organization or not? And I think that's the real challenge for us as for policymakers.
Thanks. And as you say, we have Wayed Al-Shabaki here, Dr. Al-Shabaki, from the Jordan perspective on this question. I know you have a question in the chat, but it'd also be nice to hear whether you saw any evidence of intra-crisis learning-induced policy change in Lebanon. Now, whether we can pinpoint that to learning-induced change or not is another question. But any evidence from Lebanon? Jordan, I'm sorry.
Jordan, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay, I have a general comment and a question for the panel. And upon, of course, it comes to my mind due to the Jordanian government response to the pandemic and the repercussions of this interconnected crisis. This not only healthcare or health crisis, but also economic and social and political crisis. My question is, the current situation and all the repercussions of this pandemic make us rethinking about the role of government and the size of it. The solution or the policies of responding to this pandemic reveals about many of poor and marginalized, vulnerable groups in societies. My question is, are we still managing in the mindset of neoliberalism anymore? Could we see any change on this kind of mindset? Like in Jordan, for example, we are, since 2000, we are managing on light of neoliberalism and market orientation. But now we need more governmental intervention. My question is still neoliberalism effective or not? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That may have to be our last questions, unless I see any from the audience. So, great. Oh, I lied. Here comes Amy from Victoria. Hi, Amy. I think, would it be all right if you give your question or your input now, and then we can mix it together in a panel final response?
Yeah, no, I feel very privileged. I know there's lots of people still wanting to jump in. My question was, how do we differentiate between learning and sort of like politics and interest? So the analytical point of the learning, because it's very easy to say we did something that went wrong and then we did this and now it's better. But it's also a question of what paths do we take, who do we listen to? So I'm, in a sense, connecting these earlier discussions we had about sort of the expert team and the marginalized voices that are maybe not around the table in these bigger expert groups and so on. So we've spoken about this in our earlier sessions as well. But analytically, I wonder, how do we know learning from power and interest politics? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Amy. And as Amy says, there are other questions, but we're going to have to wrap it up because we'll have one final discussion here. Olivier, you were indicating that you wanted to answer perhaps Dr. Al-Shubaki's question, but the floor is open to Menno, to Marij, to Wout, anyone else.
Well, very, very quickly, I already started to respond. I think that in the public sector, but even in the private sector, the current trends and reorganizations and creating many smaller structures, independent, more supposed to be more agile, more recountable, more transparent, whatever, actually creates incredible coordination problems in terms of crisis. And I think this is something which needs to be reassessed now during this crisis. Now, we continue in creating all these small structures, independent structures that are supposed to be more accountable and traceable and transparent if in a time of crisis and including crises, coordination becomes the key issue. And just the last point, I think something which has been also mentioned by Edward, which is really important. I think social sciences, I mean, let's be a little bit corporatist here. Social sciences have a really important role to play in this crisis. To go back to Paul's question before, I think when we published this little book, which you still can't see because it's still fuzzy, there you go. We were going against a dominant narrative produced by the government, but also by me and many experts saying, no, this was the only way to do it, and we did what we could, and there's no discussing, no questioning this. And we did not contest this, but we wanted to say, no, how do we get there? And what can we learn? And I think social sciences in this really have a very important role to play in questioning the choices made. Not saying we shouldn't have done this, but saying, how did we get there? How do we get on March 12 in France and pushing this big red button, which is the total lockdown? How do we get there? I mean, and how can we avoid in the future reaching that same point? And I think that's for social scientists, this is a really, really important issue. And this is where we have a major role to play. And also going back to Amy's question, and also saying, well, yeah, but there is power politics. I mean, there are choices being made that clearly favor some groups. In France, the medical profession has been clearly imposing its representation of the crisis all along, like in Sweden, clearly. But even in France, even more, the medical profession, in terms of curing patients, not prevention, curing. Well, this I think raises very important questions, about to what point can one interest group impose its representation of the crisis to the whole country and to decision makers? Once again, I think social scientists have a really important role to play in questioning these situations, not criticizing them, but questioning them.
Menno?
One of the questions, one of the issues was very intriguing for me. That was I would translate it in don't focus only on presidents and prime ministers, but also focus on the differences between countries with the haves and haves not, and the consequence of this crisis with regard to that topic. And finally, my last remark. For some time, I thought I was participating in the European Song Contest that takes place every year, and now the results from Helsinki and the results from Berlin and from London. And one of the main lessons of this COVID-19 crisis is this also. The possibility of this is really closely connected to the COVID-19 crisis. Not only this, but the whole consequences with the internet. 10 years ago, this wasn't possible. So one of the positive aspects also of successes of this crisis.
Very good. Last thoughts before we bring things to a close. So, I mean, to me, it's been fascinating that we've moved the discussion of learning from inter-crisis learning to intra-crisis learning. I think that's a part of the agenda which has a lot more exploring to be done. We've made the distinction between, as Sarah pointed out, kind of and Amy's political-oriented learning, which of course is always going to be there, and then the more technical, functional kinds of lessons which can be learned. And we discussed, what kinds of questions should be asked, who gets to ask those questions, do we have the data to answer those questions, and then how do we get any learning to stick down the road? So I think it's been a good start for the discussion, not the end. So thank you very much to our panelists, to our audience. Speaking of Eurovision Song Contest or any song contest, we've had input from the US, from the UK, from Canada, from Sweden, France, Germany, Finland, and Jordan. Not bad for a Thursday morning in Leiden.